Well, can you explain a little bit first about what causes mesothelioma and how it's affected people in the workplace?
Universally accepted in the medical and scientific literature that the sole cause of mesothelioma is asbestos exposure. And I'll concede that some of my adversaries say otherwise, and there's a little bit of controversy in the literature, usually created by corporate money. That other things cause mesothelioma, but everybody agrees that asbestos is the primary cause of nearly all mesotheliomas in the United States and throughout the world. And since the 1930s and really all the way through the present, there have been people that have been exposed to asbestos in the workplace in a variety of different ways. I mean, you have people who worked in the manufacturing plants where products were made that contain asbestos and they were exposed to raw asbestos fibers. We've seen people that worked in factory settings that took an asbestos product and incorporated it into some other products. So think of a vehicle that was manufactured with asbestos containing brakes.
So, how does corporate responsibility impact the way that companies handle asbestos exposure in a mesothelioma lawsuit?
It's all over the board. We have a lot of companies that we deal with, and I don't want to name names in this particular podcast. It's probably not appropriate, but there are a lot of companies that are pretty forthcoming with us, and we're able to establish that our client was exposed to their product. They accept responsibility and they want to do the right thing and try to come to a fair and reasonable resolution of whatever controversy we have. There are other companies that no matter what the evidence is, no matter what the plaintiff is, under what circumstances the exposure occurred, they deny, they fight, they do everything in their power to avoid facing any responsibility whatsoever. And it's a really big problem with what we do, because the evidence usually is overwhelming that these companies were aware when they sold asbestos containing products that they contained asbestos. I mean, of course they knew. They intended for the product to be there. They were aware that asbestos was a carcinogen. They were aware that asbestos caused, fatal cancers in people. And when we still see companies today that have faced literally thousands of lawsuits and have killed thousands of people, and they treat every case like it's new and it's different, it's a clean slate, and throw their hands up in the air and say, we're not responsible. It certainly makes our job more difficult, but that's what we've been hired to do.
In terms of the way that companies approach their corporate responsibility in mesothelioma cases changing over the years, you mentioned that now you're seeing more and more companies, the companies that do sort of fight the issue and say no, our product doesn't contain asbestos or whatever. You said there previously they would maybe admit that our products did contain it. Now you're saying they're even going so far as to fund sort of fake science to try to prove that it doesn't contain asbestos, and go almost going overboard to try to go the other direction. Are there other ways that you see that things have changed over the years in terms of the way that companies approach their responsibility?
I think that, again, a lot of companies have, kind of take polar opposite views of how they should deal with things. And, we'll see some companies that will fess up and say, yeah, if we knew then what we know today, there's not a chance we would have put this product on the market. We would have, provided warnings. Maybe it was in a setting where their employees used, asbestos products. We would have taken more safeguards. We would have done more. And whether that's genuine or not, it's impossible to say. But they're certainly saying the right things, and the way they treat litigation at least gives me some indication that that's how they feel. There are other companies that literally go out of their way to try to recreate history. Um, and they try to recreate it in a number of ways. And we mentioned, the science, and the science is really interesting because up until probably 2000, 2005, I mean, there was no controversy about asbestos causing disease. There was none. And these are decades old studies. What was also no question about is that most companies stopped making asbestos containing products long before 2000, and certainly by 2000. And again, without naming any names in particular, you've got brake manufacturers.
What do you think the role of government regulations is, in terms of ensuring that companies are held accountable for their actions regarding asbestos exposure?
So government regulations have been interesting as well. It really started with state governments. You've heard, I'm sure most of our listeners have heard of OSHA, EPA. Those are federal agencies. OSHA, for example, didn't really exist until 1971. The OSHA emergency standard was enacted for asbestos in December of 1971, and then the official standard became official in 1972, and exists today. And those standards have changed over the years. But it was really state governments that began to regulate things like asbestos going back into the 1930s. A lot of states had workers' compensation laws that they called occupational disease acts that regulated the amount of exposure that people could have in the workplace to asbestos, silica, benzene, a wide variety of chemicals. Then you fast forward into the 1940s and 50s. A lot of state governments, impose what are called threshold limit values for exposure to asbestos and other things. Back in those days, it was um, uh, measured in something called particles per cubic foot. So the threshold limit value for asbestos in most states in the United States prior to 1971 was 5 million particles per cubic foot. Now, you're probably sitting there thinking, as well as many people would, that sounds like an awful lot of asbestos. That sounds like an incredible amount of asbestos. 5 million particles per cubic foot of asbestos sounds like you could be exposed to a lot of it. I wish I had it with me right now to show, but we had an expert years ago measure 5 million particles per cubic foot and put it into a vial. So imagine a vial the size of a average writing pen, and probably only a couple, maybe an inch of that vial would comprise of 5 million particles per cubic foot of asbestos.